How would you test that function? That is the question. And trust me, junior, regular, senior, and expert developers would answer it in totally different way. I'm Patrick, and I'm a senior software engineer with plenty of years of experience as interviewee, interviewer, and a mentor, helping others to do better on interviews. I will explain you 8 areas to cover when answering open programming interview questions for you to look like an expert. During an interview process, you are being tested on several levels, from your problem-solving skills, teamwork, foundational knowledge, domain knowledge, culture fit, solving niche industry problems, passion, and things like that. Everything depends on the company and their needs. But whenever you are asked open questions, you can trust me that interviewers will try to read between the lines, searching for pieces of those skills. Obviously, there are the ones that go through the list of questions and answers, and your job is only to fit the scheme. But conscious interviewers on good interviews will try to dig deeper and try to excavate your real knowledge, experience, and background. In the end, in programming, it is all about understanding and not memorizing formulas. So the first area that you should try to cover when answering open questions, it would be just quoting documentation and answering the question in a right way. And this is the foundation of answering most of the questions. You simply deliver needed answer. But this is not the end of the story, because you can convey something more. For example, first area that experts, people with profound knowledge and passion could incorporate in answering such question, it would be a historical background. So, for example, if you are asked what Django is, you can just answer this question and continue by showing a brief history of how this framework emerged, what problems at that time industry was facing, and what Django was supposed to solve, and how we achieved that. For those who don't know, Django is Python web development framework. So, instead of answering this in an ordinary way, that is what it is and how it works, you can start from a brief history that it was released back in 2005. Development started 2 years earlier. It was developed by Django Foundation for JL World Journal, which is news websites, and they were dealing with problems of frequent updates and database-based websites, and so on and on and on. And as a fun fact, you can say that nowadays these websites stays on WordPress. And you might think, okay, but I will be not prolonging answering simple questions this way. It is up to the interviewer to interrupt and say, okay, that's enough. That's the first thing. And the second is that the more knowledge you will show, the better for you. But try to keep it concise and organized, because the way you express yourself, whether it is logical, whether it is well organized, it influences the way you are being perceived as a person who can explain topics well and talk in an interesting way. So do not prolong talking about those non-relevant facts for too long. Just talk about it briefly. And the framework is only an example here. This technique can be applied to any other technology, service, module, or even a utility function. For example, you can say that this utility function has been added to this programming language with this and this version. And before, we were forced to go for some external libraries like this, and that. Second area are trade-offs. People responsible for projects, for tech stacks, and generally more important decisions in organizations, they have to have wider recognition of what's happening on the market. So you started answering your question about Django, then you can go to comparing Django to other frameworks like Flask, Fast API, and things like that. So you already said something about historical background, maybe you added some fun facts. Now you go to pros and cons of this framework. Another area is experience. So whenever you already talked about historical background, trade-offs, Then, to support your words and show that you really know what you are talking about, tell something about the context of usage of whatever you mentioned. When talking about this framework and other frameworks, you can give practical example of what problems you faced, how did you solve that, what are advantages and disadvantages in particular context of using this framework or the other. What is the most important? It is to show that you really know what you are talking about and you are not only theorizing, that you can also speak from practical perspective. And when talking about it, you can mention a couple of solutions to one problem, because like referring to talking about trade-offs, you as an expert has to be able to find the most optimized solution, and sometimes it requires to dig deeper into requirements, approaches, end goals, and generally consequences of your decisions. That's why it is like a small time for brainstorming on what this decision might lead to. And the more solutions, the more consequences you can show, it means that you basically have more profound, wider knowledge about the area. Obviously, it has to make sense. When talking about all of that, also try to go deeper and try to talk about everything of that from like lower perspective. And also look for non-obvious solutions. For example, in React front-end JavaScript framework, there is a hook called use state. And when answering such question, you can firstly quote the documentation, talk about what is the state by quoting the documentation. Then, when it comes to historical background, you can go back in time to previous versions of the usage of state in React. So, how we used to use state in older frameworks. And you can go even deeper and say that state, it is a design pattern developed and propagated by the Gang of Four, firstly on the conference called OPSLA, something like that, back in the 90s. But you see the pattern. You look for something deeper and non-obvious connections. So you have use state hook, you go to state, and then you go to state design pattern. When answering simple question, you already shown that you don't only know what use state is, but that you are also at least aware of design patterns, some history, and it also shows passion and that you dig deeper, you are able to connect the dots. What is also cool is that for me, it happens very often that when I go deeper when answering one question, interviewer says that, oh, you already answered 3 next questions that I had on my list, or something like that. And what's cool about it, it is that once you mention something by yourself, they are not prone to dig more in that subject, because very often they immediately assume that you know something about it. You know what I mean? It is just like once you voluntarily talk about something, they already wave their hands on this subject. Also, from the perspective of an interviewer, the deeper you go in answering one question, the less time we as interviewers have to ask other questions. We have limited time to interview all the candidates. So if you go deeper in some questions and you start talking and talking and talking, and what you say makes sense, it just limits our time to ask other questions more. So it's some kind of reverse the control of the interview, because the interviewee, by taking more time, limits, the possibilities to ask other unpredicted questions. That's why once you know the answer, once you know historical context, usages, traits of pros, cons, and things like that, it is your business even more to use all the knowledge gathered on that subject. Another thing is that whenever possible, try to show results. So when you are asked some questions, comparing different things, talking about trade-offs, then it is good to mention that by using this and this instead of this and that, we saved hundreds of unnecessary requests. We optimized this process from taking all night to 3 hours. Another area, it is something that we call project consciousness. Normally, junior developers are not aware of decisions related to, let's say, budgeting, project management, decisions related to tech stack, and other pretty advanced things. But as a junior developer, it doesn't mean that you cannot stand out in this area when answering interview questions as well. Your job is just to go to somebody responsible for such things in your organization and ask why we chose this strategy of eliminating tech debt, why we chose this library over other library, or why we assign tasks this way. Just show sincere interest in whatever is happening in your project, and then use it when describing your experience. It will show maturity and, as I said, consciousness of the project. Another area are soft skills, and it might come to your mind, okay, this is technical interviews, this is about technical skills, framework, language, code quality, design patterns, and things like this. How the hell I can bring soft skills to the table? And this is how. By answering question, you can just mention how you explain this kind of concept to other people. Let's say I'm asked what it is something in React. You can answer it the way that normally in the past I was explaining it this way to my students because I found it in some book. But once, when working on something with one of my students, with one of my colleagues or something, we found out a good analogy, and this is how I explain it now. Imagine that you are an interviewer. The guy is talking about having students, about teaching them something, about changing approach over time because of analyzing, optimizing the process. It makes way better impression. And remember that this is an example of mine. If you don't teach anyone anything, don't bring it during your interview, but you can go for something that you have already done in the past. So, for example, presentation, speech, talking to colleagues, talking to clients, talking to non-technical people. Just mention something related to communication skills or some other soft skills. And one of very important skills of expert developers, especially the ones responsible for communication with different departments, different developers, maybe clients, is ability to explain technical subjects in approachable way. That's why soft skills are also very important, and how you can incorporate showing that you are good in that. The good approach is to do it from the big picture to details. So it is like with gravity. Everyone knows that when you drop something, it falls. Then you talk about how it looks on Earth, how it looks on different planets, that it depends on mass, and then you bring formulas, mathematical equations, and things like that. Not reversely. Obviously, it also depends. You have to choose when you go for what, because all the words that you use are tools and you should use them carefully. Extra tip is try to be creative. Use visuals, use real examples and anecdotes, use metaphors. One of the examples on how to be creative happened to me by accident, because I was having an online interview and the day before I was working with my students on something, explaining them some concepts on the whiteboard that was still hanging behind. And I was answering some question and it came to my mind to start explaining that on that whiteboard. As it was anyway visible for them, I was like, wait a minute, I have a whiteboard here. It will be way easier for me to explain you this concept on whiteboard. Would you mind if I would? And they were like, wow, that was super cool. That was something that they didn't expect at all. So this is also the way on how you can stand out from some honorable mentions worth speaking about. First one is asking questions. Whenever you're being asked about how would you handle something, how would you do something, implement something, ask them what do they use and try to talk about it, because why not? You can give alternative approaches, solutions, but the most important is to fit to their needs. Another thing is, for example, CS background. If you know how something works underneath, brief explanation, it's always a plus. Also, talking about the newest trends, best practices, once possible, once it suits to the answer, to the question. These are things worth speaking of. And now you might think like, oh, but this is a lot of knowledge, a lot of context, and lots of different areas that I have to develop myself in. There are shortcuts, like for example, choosing some narrow domain that you can become an expert quicker. But in the end, you will have to do your homework anyway, especially that artificial intelligence is coming for all of us, and only the ones that will be able to adapt to the changing market the best will survive. So it would be good for you to start doing something extra to gather knowledge, skills, and experience in other areas related to programming. So, for example, start vlogging, going to conferences, maybe voluntarily teaching others, starting your project, working on your personal brand, and going to hackathons, starting your own SaaS application, and things. Nowadays it is way easier. Even with this list, it will be very easy for you to just go to ChatGPT and ask about these things. Firstly, you go to Google, you look for most common questions in terms of React developers, JavaScript developers, Python developers, .NET developers, Java developers, blah, 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 blah. You have lots of lists online. Then, instead of using those simple answers, you go to ChatGPT, you go to Google, and you look for all of those aspects that I told you. You can even create a simple prompt that will already create answers for you. Obviously, it is your job to do the homework and find out whether those answers provided by artificial intelligence make sense. Now is the time to reveal the answer to the question from the beginning of this video. Apart from tools, I will give you a couple of examples of levels of the answer to this question that I have heard myself. First level, it would be to check whether this function returns correct value. So you check what happens if we add negative numbers, zeros, floating points, and things like that. Another level, it would be to check edge cases and exceptions, especially that it is JavaScript. So what will happen whenever we will pass object, array on any other more complex structure? Maybe proposing how to make this function more idiot-proof. Another level, it would be considering things related to maximum limit of numbers, because every programming language has some kind of limit in terms of used numbers. Another thing, it would be things related to precision. Everyone who has ever dealt with more complex operation in JavaScript in terms of math knows what I am talking about. And the person with the most profound knowledge about numbers in JavaScript and generally in programming languages would even go deeper and start explaining how it works underneath, related to IEEE 754 standards, allocating memory, a little bit about bits, hardware, and things like that. And this is only an example. If something else comes to your mind, write it down in the comments. There are way more areas and details that in the end make you look like an expert. If you would like to know more about it, then go to the link down below. I will share with you the simplest strategy on how to double your income by becoming an expert. And before choosing your niche, choosing a hot-heated problem of the industry, this is something based on economics. There are no tricks, it is super simple. Just click the link and we see each other on the other side. It is not like you have to cover all of these areas when answering every single question. It is not even like you have to cover all of them during the entire interview. It is something to keep in mind when you are preparing for interview, going through list of questions for you to have a wider knowledge and to be able to explain certain concepts better, to stand out. Last but not least, what if you don't know the answer to some question. Then simply
Let you know.